A few days. That is all the time Washington has given Moscow to change course. If you have been following the news, you have seen the countdown everywhere. Experts warning of a major shift, leaders talking about red lines, and social media already buzzing with rumors of World War III. But what actually happens if Russia ignores this American ultimatum? And why could this moment, out of all the crises in the last 2 years, really change the game for everyone watching from the US and beyond? Tonight, we are cutting through the noise. We will break down what makes this ultimatum different from the ones before it, and why the timeline matters. We will look at how Moscow and its allies are responding, not just with words, but with concrete moves on the ground. We will dig into the real consequences if the deadline passes with no deal, from military escalation to global economic fallout. Then, we will share the specific signals to watch for, so you know what truly counts, not just what makes headlines. And at the end, I'm going to show you the key for reading these crises with a clear head, so you are never just another piece in someone else's panic cycle. Let's start with the basics. On July 28th, the US set a new deadline for Russia, 10 to 12 days to show progress toward peace in Ukraine, or face a new wave of severe sanctions, tariffs, and, as Trump said, something else. Reuters and the BBC both confirmed the details of this warning, and it quickly ricocheted across world media. The timeline matters. Unlike past statements that left months of uncertainty, this ultimatum is precise. 12 days. That's not just a rhetorical line. It is a window for Russia to demonstrate real movement or prepare for another round of American pressure. The US made it clear that this would not be just financial pain, but could include steps that affect Russia's access to global markets, energy exports, and even physical movement of goods. What stands out is not only the speed, but the context. This is happening after months of slow, grinding escalation in Ukraine and after several failed rounds of diplomatic talks in Istanbul and Geneva. If you have been watching, you know that the war has become a test of patience, not just firepower. For the US to set a public clock like this means Washington wants to put maximum pressure on Moscow, making the deadline itself a tool of psychological warfare, as much as real policy. Why is this important for Americans? Because what happens when a nuclear power is given a time limit and forced to respond in the open with the whole world watching? It is not just about what Russia does, but how the US and its allies are prepared to enforce the consequences. And there's more to this than just statements. The real story is in how both sides are already maneuvering before the deadline even hits. So, what has Russia actually done since the deadline was announced? Publicly, the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has said Moscow takes note of the US ultimatum, but refuses to be drawn into what it calls an artificial countdown. Behind the scenes, however, the signals are much more complicated. Analysts from the BBC and Foreign Affairs have pointed out that in the last 72 hours, Moscow has increased its missile attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, including a strike on a hospital in Zaporizhzhia and a prison in Kamianske, with dozens of civilian casualties. The message is unmistakable. Russia is not about to back down just because Washington set a clock. But it is not only about violence. Russian state media has begun emphasizing new strategic partnerships with countries like Iran and North Korea. The Guardian recently covered a visit by the head of Roscosmos, Russia's space agency, to Washington, a move that, on the surface, is about civilian space cooperation, but which many see as a signal that Moscow is seeking new channels for dialogue even as it hardens its military posture. Meanwhile, in the last 2 days, there have been new deployments of S-400 air defense systems in Iran, officially described as routine, but occurring right after US and European warnings over Tehran's nuclear activities. The same pattern shows up in Eastern Europe. NATO has reported increased Russian drone activity over the Baltic, with several incursions near Lithuanian and Polish airspace, prompting emergency NATO intercepts and heightened alerts in the region, according to Defense One and Reuters. These are not random moves. This is how modern crises unfold. Layers of visible and invisible maneuvers, all signaling intent, all testing the other side's resolve. So, while Moscow is keeping its public statements cautious, its actions suggest a mixture of defiance and careful preparation for whatever might come after the deadline. For the US, the real challenge is to read these signals without overreacting or missing the warning signs that actually matter. But the question remains, does this all add up to real escalation, or is it another round in the cycle of pressure and bluff? Coming up, we will look at the real consequences. What could actually happen if the deadline passes without progress? This is the heart of the matter. What does the United States actually do if, a few days from now, Russia has not shifted its stance, not made progress towards a negotiated solution, or even escalated further? According to recent analysis by Reuters and Defense One, the Trump administration is not just talking about another round of the usual sanctions. This time, Washington is preparing a layered response that would hit Russia in several ways at once, starting with banking and energy, but quickly extending to something far more sensitive: the global arteries of trade. When American officials talk about restricting Russia's access to international shipping lanes, especially in the Black Sea and the Baltic, they are not making a minor threat. These two maritime corridors are lifelines not only for Russian exports, like oil and grain, but also for the economies of Eastern Europe, Turkey, and beyond. The Black Sea, in particular, has become a critical theater since the start of the Ukraine war. Each year, billions of dollars of goods, from wheat to fertilizer to machinery, flow through its ports. Blocking or even threatening to block this traffic would immediately raise the stakes, not just for Moscow, but for the whole region. A real maritime embargo would mean physical enforcement, potentially involving US and NATO ships facing off directly with the Russian Navy. This is not just diplomatic signaling, it is the kind of confrontation that, according to Foreign Affairs and several retired US commanders, brings us back to the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. If you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, or even the incidents in the Black Sea in the late 1980s, you know how close rival ships have come to accidental collisions, with seconds to decide between escalation and retreat. The technology today may be more advanced, but that only shortens the decision time. When warships from opposing sides maneuver in tight waters, a single mistake, a radar misreading, or even a deliberate provocation could ignite a crisis within minutes. For the US, enforcing such a blockade would mean not only military risk, but also the responsibility of managing international law and the interests of dozens of other nations whose ships pass through these same waters every week. And that's just the maritime front. At the same time, the question of arming Ukraine is front and center. There are growing reports, covered in Nikkei Asia and the BBC, that the US is ready to accelerate deliveries of advanced air defense and strike systems, Patriot, Tomahawk cruise missiles, and potentially F-16 fighter jets. On paper, this seems like a continuation of past support. In reality, it would mark a significant shift in Ukraine's ability to defend its skies and, crucially, to strike Russian targets further behind the front lines. The logic is straightforward. The greater the risk of Russian escalation, the greater the pressure in Washington to show that the US is not backing down. But as recent history has shown, these weapons are not just deterrents. The last time Ukraine received a major package of new systems, Russia unleashed a wave of retaliation, missile strikes targeting not just military installations, but also the civilian power grid, railway junctions, and critical infrastructure as far away as Poland and Germany. This is where the risk becomes truly global. For viewers in America, it is not just a question of supporting an ally. Every time advanced weapons cross the border, the possibility grows that Russia will respond with cyber attacks or other asymmetric measures against NATO countries, testing the alliance's resolve under Article 5. And no matter how prepared American forces are, history shows that the more actors get involved, the harder it is to control every outcome. The economic impact cannot be ignored either. Any move to block Russian energy exports or physically interrupt the flow of oil and gas through the Black Sea would send immediate shockwaves through world markets. As reported by Defense One and Reuters, gas prices could spike overnight, and critical supply chains for food, fertilizer, and raw materials could see instant disruption. Remember, Europe is still deeply dependent on certain Russian exports, and even the United States, while more insulated, would feel the effects at the pump and in the price of basic goods. This is not speculation. After the first rounds of sanctions in 2022, global wheat prices doubled in a matter of weeks, and fertilizer shortages hit farms from Brazil to the Midwest. If the U.S. pushes for a real maritime embargo, or even a partial blockade of Black Sea ports, the consequences would ripple far beyond the region, potentially leading to inflation, shortages, and new political headaches at home. All these layers, military, economic, cyber, create a system where a single trigger can set off a cascade of consequences. Ignoring the deadline does not mean one dramatic explosion. It means a chain reaction, a series of shocks that unfold across different fronts, often in unexpected ways. For the American public and for anyone watching this crisis, the message is clear. What happens in the next 12 days is not just about Russia and Ukraine. It is about how a superpower enforces red lines, how alliances hold together under stress, and how fragile the balance can be when every move is made with the whole world watching. This is why it matters to follow not just the headlines, but the deeper signals, the economic indicators, the military maneuvers, and the subtle shifts in diplomacy that together reveal whether we are heading for de-escalation or for a new chapter of crisis. And remember, while political leaders make the decisions, it is ordinary people who feel the impact first, whether it is at the gas station, the grocery store, or in the security of daily life. This is why these 12 days matter, and why we need to watch every step, not just the big announcements. And it's not just about what Washington or Moscow does. The other players are moving too, right now, in ways that could tip the balance. It is not only the US and Russia at the table. As the deadline approaches, other powers are already shifting their positions. Iran's deployment of new S-400 systems, covered by Reuters and Al Jazeera, signals Tehran's preparation for a possible Israeli response, as well as a move to strengthen its partnership with Moscow. North Korea's latest declarations, confirmed by the BBC, close the door to dialogue with Washington and raise the possibility of more military cooperation with Russia, even talk of sending advisors or equipment to Ukraine, a scenario unthinkable just a year ago. China remains publicly neutral, but analysts at Nikkei Asia have noted a rise in quiet diplomatic visits between Moscow and Beijing aimed at coordinating economic and security policies if the West tightens sanctions. At the same time, European countries are on alert. Poland has urged its citizens to leave Russia, and NATO has rotated fighter squadrons and increased air patrols in Romania and the Baltics, all moves confirmed by Reuters and the BBC. Each of these actors is making decisions based on their own interests, but together they make the situation much more complex. For American viewers, this means that the outcome is not just about what Trump or Putin decide, it is about a whole system of alliances, rivalries, and unpredictable moves. This is how escalation works in 2025, not with a single dramatic gesture, but with a web of small interconnected shifts that add up to a much bigger risk. Still, with all these moving parts, how do you tell the difference between real danger and the usual media noise? In a moment, I'll show you the specific signals to watch in the coming days, so you can spot the real escalation before anyone else. Here is the key for anyone trying to make sense of this crisis. With news coming every hour, it is easy to get lost in headlines and rumors. But analysts at the BBC, Reuters, and Defense One agree there are specific indicators that show when a crisis is about to get much worse. First, watch for physical movements, sudden massing of troops, ships moving into contested zones like the Black Sea or Baltic, or emergency exercises announced with little notice. These are classic signs that an actor is preparing for something more than just a show of force. Second, look at official statements, when leaders stop talking, or when diplomatic hotlines go quiet. That is often a sign that negotiations have broken down behind the scenes. Third, monitor economic measures. New sanctions on critical sectors or the sudden shutdown of pipelines and ports are not just economic moves, they are often signals of something much bigger. Finally, cyber activity. If you see a spike in cyber attacks on infrastructure, especially in Europe or the US, that is often the canary in the coal mine for a coming escalation. Remember, during the last major crisis in 2022, cyber attacks hit the Polish rail system hours before the first missiles landed in Ukraine. For viewers who want to stay ahead, focus on these signals, not just the noise of daily headlines. Now let's step back and make sense of the bigger picture. What does this countdown really mean, and what should you take away as you watch the next few days unfold? This is where it all comes together. The American ultimatum to Russia is not just a news cycle. It is a high-stakes test of strategy, credibility, and risk. The next few days are not just about deadlines and threats, but about the limits of pressure in a world where every actor is watching the others, and where even small moves can trigger big consequences. If you have followed us this far, you are not just consuming news. You are part of a community that asks real questions. So, what should you be watching? Look for the signals we discussed and ask yourself, is this escalation real or just part of a negotiation game? In the end, the biggest risk is not missing a headline, but missing the shift in how these crises are managed. As history shows, the moments that matter are often the ones where no one is paying attention, until suddenly everything changes. So stay sharp, question what you hear, and remember, the world is shaped not just by what leaders do, but by how ordinary people like you choose to react and prepare. If you want more in-depth analysis as this story unfolds, subscribe to Safety Zone and join the conversation. What are you watching for in these next days? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Stay informed, stay calm, and stay ready.